The sky over the Appalachians wasn't meant to be silent. It was meant to echo with the distant, rhythmic growl of logging trucks, the sudden boom of a 12-gauge during hunting season, and the constant, reassuring whisper of the wind through ancient pines. But on that Tuesday, the sky shrieked. It was a sound like tearing metal across 1,000 miles, followed by a deeper, bass thrum that vibrated the very calcium in their teeth. Jedediah "Jed" Hayes, the undisputed patriarch of their quartet, was skinning a deer beside the creek when the first shadow fell. Jed was a man carved from hickory, lean, tough, and quiet. His primary tool was a lever-action .30-30, but his real asset was his mind, which processed terrain like a five-star general studying a topographical map. He looked up, squinting at the midday sun, but saw only a smudge of impossible green fire. He dropped the knife and reached for the rifle. "Earl, Daisy, Skeeter, get to the cellar now." The invasion was swift, devastating, and impersonal. The aliens, the KRYL, as they would later learn from intercepted broadcasts, didn't bother with conventional warfare. They deployed massive, obsidian-black motherships that cast mile-long shadows and disgorged sleek, three-legged combat drones and heavily armored infantry. They sought the population centers, the infrastructure, the easy targets. They missed the mountains. The four of them huddled in the cold, damp, root cellar behind Jed's cabin for 3 days, listening to the world burn. The first day, they heard the military jets scream overhead, followed by silencing blasts. The second, static on the old shortwave radio. By the third, only the distant, a rhythmic pounding of the Carwellel's heavy walkers disturbed the stillness. They were 4 souls. Jed Hayes, the 32-year-old leader. He wasn't educated in a city sense, but he knew how to read sign, how to move a group through the dense, unforgiving wilderness without leaving a trace, and how to stay alive when everything was trying to kill you. Earl Higgins, 28, his cousin. Earl could fix anything with an engine, a wire, or a moving part. He was the local genius who rebuilt old tractors using scrap and who, before the collapse, was building a Tesla coil in his garage just for the fun of it. When the world needed a wrench, Earl was the man. Skeeter Jenkins, the youngest at 24. Skeeter was a ghost. Raised by an elderly grandmother who taught him the old ways of trapping and bow hunting, he could walk through a field of dry leaves and sound like a falling feather. He specialized in silent takedowns and was the only one who didn't carry a firearm as his primary weapon, preferring a custom-made recurved bow and a quiver full of hand-forged broadheads. And finally, Daisy Mae Carver, 30. She was the group's soul and its fury. A certified nurse's aide turned prepper, she had a meticulous knowledge of medicinal herbs, field trauma, and, most importantly, fertilizer chemistry. If you needed a wound stitched or a bridge blown, Daisy was your only choice. On the morning of the 4th day, the pounding got closer. "They're sweeping the foothills," Jed said, his voice flat as he looked through a narrow vent slit. "Cleaning up. They look like big, shiny roaches," Earl muttered, cleaning grease from his nails with a pocket knife. "And their guns sound like a mosquito with a trumpet." "We ain't sitting here to be found," Daisy stated, checking the contents of her pack. Bags of ammonium nitrate, small detonators, and gauze. Jed looked at the other 3. "We got 4 days of rations left here. We got enough ammo to fight a bear, but not a damn war. They got vehicles, air cover, and whatever that buzzing noise is." Skeeter spoke, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, but carrying the weight of the mountain itself. "They ain't got the hollows, Jed. They ain't got the caves. They don't know about the devil's backbone. They don't know where the ground gives way." That was the turning point. The realization that their perceived disadvantage, their isolation, their rough living, their deep, almost genetic knowledge of this rugged land, was the one weapon the KRYL hadn't accounted for. "All right," Jed said, nodding slowly. "We're the Hollowmen now. We protect the home field, the guerrilla genesis." The first phase was all survival and intelligence gathering. They abandoned the cabin, retreating 2 days deep into the most complex, geologically unstable region of the forest, an area riddled with sinkholes, cliffs, and abandoned mica mines. Their base became the Fortress, a hidden cave complex accessible only by traversing a narrow, overgrown goat path that Daisy had booby-trapped with tripwires attached to empty tin cans. The KRYL, in their arrogance, established a supply base just 5 miles from Jed's old cabin, a wide, flat logging depot. It was protected by high-frequency energy fences and patrolled by the 3-legged sentry drones they called tripods. "Look at that thing," Earl whispered, peering through Jed's ancient spotting scope at a tripod. "All armor and glowy bits. But I bet it's got a battery pack the size of a Ford engine block." Jed's task force's first mission was simple: acquire intel and materials. "Daisy, you stay high. Watching the ridge," Jed instructed. "Skeeter, and me go down, silent. Earl, you get a clean shot at that radio tower antenna." "You want me to shoot their radio?" Earl asked. "No." Jed grinned, tapping his old, battered rifle. "I want you to shoot the lightning rod beside their radio. See if they like getting a little extra juice." The mission was a masterclass in exploiting technological blind spots. The tripods were programmed to scan for human body heat signatures and metallic masses moving above ground. They were blind to a man belly crawling through cold mud and deaf to a silent arrow. Skeeter moved like liquid shadow, covering the 100 yards to the perimeter fence. While the KRYL relied on high-tech scanners that failed to account for the mineral-rich, electromagnetically chaotic soil of the mountains, Skeeter relied on his feet, sensing the faint hum of the perimeter fence, then noting the briefest, most predictable blind spot in the drone patrol cycle. He signaled Jed, who took position. Earl, with his customized glass-bedded rifle, took careful aim at a 20-foot-tall lightning rod attached to the main comms building. Crack! The sound was instantly swallowed by the dense woods. The lightning rod snapped and whipped into the comms antenna. A brilliant blue-white spark engulfed the tower, followed by a shower of black smoke and the sudden, loud pop of electrical systems overloading. Pandemonium ensued among the handful of KRYL soldiers, humanoid figures encased in black, chitinous armor. They communicated using high-pitched clicks and whistles. In the confusion, Skeeter drew an arrow, aimed not at a KRYL, but at a tripod's nearest joint, where the leg met the central body. His arrow was tipped with an old, custom-machined steel penetrator designed for maximum kinetic impact, not explosion. Thwack! The leg joint, designed to articulate quickly and quietly, shattered under the sheer force, leveraging a microscopic seam in the armor. The tripod collapsed, sparking and shrieking. Before the remaining KRYL could organize, Jed put 3 swift, controlled shots into the main power generator, plunging the camp into darkness save for the emergency lights. They retreated, leaving a tripod downed and a comms tower fried. The Tinkerer's triumph. The downed tripod was Jed's prize, but Earl's fascination. Under the canopy of the fortress, working by the dim glow of a repurposed carbide lamp, Earl began his work. They used some kind of energy cell, Earl explained days later, holding up a crystal that pulsed with faint blue light. "It's like a super battery. Can't recharge it yet, but I bet I can make it vent." Earl spent the next 2 weeks dissecting the drone's optical sensors and power regulation system. He realized the KRYL armor, while formidable against kinetic rounds, was vulnerable to precisely targeted electromagnetic pulses, EMP. Their internal communication systems were sensitive to outside interference. He took a few pounds of Daisy's non-electric blasting caps, wired them to the tripod's optical array, and encased the whole thing in a heavy steel cooking pot, sealed with duct tape and sap. The KRYL relied on seamless integration. Earl created elegant, disruptive chaos. The Hollowmen's tactics evolved. They never engaged in a stand-up fight. They used the landscape as their primary weapon. They established the Widow's Trail, a kilometer-long section of a mountain pass where a small, natural spring had eroded the limestone underneath the forest floor, creating numerous hidden drop-offs and unstable footing. Jed let the KRYL find their calling card, a crude spray-painted sign on an old oak, Wolverines. The KRYL responded with force. A convoy of 3 armored transports and a full squad of 30 armored infantry were sent to sweep the area. Jed watched from a high-up blind, the .30-30 resting on a tree branch, while Skeeter covered their rear flank with his bow, camouflaged in a small rhododendron thicket. Daisy was positioned halfway down the trail. As the KRYL vehicles entered the Widow's Trail, the chaos began. The lead transport hit a stretch of earth that Skeeter and Jed had spent 3 nights undermining, replacing solid dirt with loose shale and moss. The ground gave way, and the heavy transport tilted violently, slamming its side armor into a sheer rock wall. Before the KRYL could react, a small, dark bundle sailed from the tree line and landed on the transport's roof. Daisy May's Mountain Blossom, a simple pipe bomb filled with railroad nails and black powder. Crump, the explosive force, augmented by the confined space, cracked the armor plating and sent shrapnel into the remaining 2 transports, wounding several infantrymen. But the real show was Earl's. As the KRYL infantry disembarked and formed their defensive line, their armor humming with defensive energy, Earl triggered his masterpiece. He had buried 5 of his super pot EMPs along the trail and connected them to a single detonator he controlled via a 100-foot wire. K-chunk, K-chunk, K-chunk. Not a sound, but a pulse. The powerful, focused electromagnetic burst from the repurposed tripod energy cells hit the KRYL infantry like a physical wave. Their sophisticated HUDs went black. Their comms systems shrieked, then died. Their energy weapons sputtered. The KRYL went from confident super soldiers to blind, confused targets whose armor was now just heavy metal. "Now, Skeeter," Jed yelled, switching from his rifle to a short-barreled shotgun loaded with slugs. Skeeter emerged from the thicket, a blur of motion. In the silent combat that followed, their superior local knowledge was the ultimate tech. The KRYL, disoriented and clicking furiously, were used to fighting on flat, stable ground. Here, every step was a trap, every shadow a potential death. Skeeter used the steep incline to his advantage, closing the distance while the KRYL struggled with their heavy, suddenly useless armor. He moved behind a soldier, wrapped a length of deer sinew around its neck, and used his mountain strength to pull it backward into a hidden fissure. Silent. Gone. Jed and Daisy, coordinating their fire, targeted the joints and seams of the KRYL armor exposed by the temporary paralysis. They weren't shooting to kill the first time, only to disable. You don't win by killing them all. You win by making them scared to step off the road. Jed had told them. The battle lasted only 10 minutes. The Hollowmen secured several working energy rifles, which Earl immediately began studying, and retreated, leaving behind a scene of chaos and confusion. For the KRYL, it was unthinkable. They had been defeated by 4 primitive humans in an area their satellites deemed worthless. The spark of resistance. The KRYL responded by quadrupling their ground patrols and deploying small, maneuverable flyers they called wasp drones. The stakes were raised. The Hollowmen, however, were getting better. Earl had successfully reverse-engineered the KRYL energy rifles. He couldn't create the power cells, but he could reroute their charging ports to run off a customized car battery he carried in a backpack. The result was a weapon with less total juice, but one that fired heavier, more devastating pulses. Skeeter started leading patrols into impossible terrain, trapping them in flash flood zones during rainstorms, or simply exhausting them by forcing them up ridiculously steep slopes. Daisy's arsenal became legendary. She developed a proximity-triggered explosive made from a mixture of black powder, ground glass, and a repurposed tripod sensor. She placed them along the bases of large, ancient trees. When a heavy KRYL vehicle passed, the sensor would trigger, blowing the tree down across the road, creating an instant, impassable barricade. Word began to spread. The resistance fighters hiding in the cities, relying on outdated military manuals and sheer courage, heard whispers of the mountain lions or Hollowmen, the people who seemed to kill the aliens with shadows and sticks. They were providing hope, a belief that the enemy could be beaten. Jed received a coded transmission, barely audible on his scavenged KRYLL comms unit, from a surviving U.S. military unit operating covertly hundreds of miles away. They're using a central coordination node. High peak. Signal strength is off the charts. Take it out, and the global command structure collapses. Jed looked at the coordinates. It was Pine Ridge Peak, the highest point in their entire region. And on it, the KRYLL had built a colossal, rotating antennae array on the foundations of the old State Fire Lookout Tower. This wasn't a skirmish. It was the entire war fought on their front yard. The climax, Pine Ridge Peak. The mission was high risk, high yield. They were going to blow the command antenna. They chose a rainy, windy night for the ascent. The noise of the weather would mask their movements, and the high moisture content in the air would naturally dampen some of the KRYLL's advanced optical sensors. Earl, wearing his custom-modified backpack battery, carried the prize. 5 gallons of highly concentrated liquid fuel scavenged from a local farmer's diesel tank, mixed with Daisy's strongest fertilizer blend, all packaged in heavy-duty milk jugs. This time, the explosives weren't for a roadblock, they were for a mountain. The final 200 feet of the peak were sheer rock face, slick with rain, the kind of ascent that would require ropes and professional gear for an urban climber. For Jed and Skeeter, who had spent their lives scaling these cliffs for deer and wild ginseng, it was a rigorous walk. They took out the 2 perimeter tripods guarding the base of the tower silently. Jed used an adapted fishing wire, coated in adhesive, to cross the high-frequency fence without tripping the alarm, a trick he learned setting snares for coyotes. The interior of the tower was a single, large, prefabricated metal room dominated by the base of the massive antenna and a handful of KRYLL engineers attending consoles. "Skeeter, you take the console crew," Jed ordered, drawing his Silent Point .45 pistol, a gift from a retired military uncle. "Daisy, you and Earl start packing the base structure. I'm covering the entrance." The fight inside was short and brutal. Skeeter, moving through the structure's ventilation shafts, dropped down behind the engineers, using the butt of his bow to deliver quick, disabling blows to the back of the neck, minimizing noise. Meanwhile, Daisy and Earl worked with terrifying speed and professionalism. Daisy knew the exact structural stress points of the antenna base, the metal crossbeams that bore the weight. "You put it right here, Earl," Daisy whispered, pointing to the structural junction where an explosive charge would create maximum torsional failure. "This'll take out the main brace. The weight of that antenna will do the rest." Earl carefully wired the jugs of homemade napalm fertilizer mix to the structural beams. He then attached the detonator, a single customized blasting cap with a 20-minute timer. Jed, holding the entrance, heard the rising shriek of incoming wasp drones. The KRYLL had finally located the intruders. "Time to go, team," Jed yelled. They scrambled out of the tower and began the perilous, slick descent. The wasp drones were on them quickly, zipping and buzzing like giant, angry hornets, firing rapid bursts of energy. Daisy turned, pulled a small, custom-made flashbang from her pack, a simple M80 wrapped in steel wool, and threw it directly into the path of the closest drone. The detonation scrambled the drone's optical systems, sending it crashing into the rock face. They reached their prearranged extraction point, a thick stand of old-growth timber, just as the 20-minute timer hit 0. They didn't hear the explosion. They felt it. It was not a sharp, violent sound, but a deep, subterranean roar, followed by the terrifying, scraping shriek of thousands of tons of metal shearing and twisting. The massive coordination antenna, the KRYLL's electronic lighthouse, crumpled. It didn't explode outward. It imploded, smashing down onto the command center below it, burying the central nerve cluster of the invasion under a mountain of twisted steel and stone. The legend of the mountain lions. They watched the aftermath from their sanctuary. The KRYLL bases in the valley below went quiet, then chaotic. The carefully coordinated patrols dissolved. The wasp drones, now flying erratically, began crashing into each other. The KRYLL, so reliant on their flawless network, were now fighting blind, unable to communicate effectively across vast distances. The coordinated global invasion had just been reduced to 1 million localized skirmishes. The transmission Jed picked up later that week confirmed it. The remaining military resistance units, the scattered militias, and the urban fighters had suddenly felt the pressure lift. The enemy was disorganized, fearful, and slow to react. A massive opportunity opened. They never sought glory. They never left the mountains. They became the legend of the hills, the rumor that ran like fire through the surviving resistance networks. They were the Hollowmen, the mountain lions. They were the proof that no amount of advanced technology could overcome a person who knew every path, every creek, every weakness of their own home. Jed leaned against a rock, cleaning the carbon from his rifle. Earl was tinkering with a newly found HFY helmet, trying to turn it into a thermal viewing device. Daisy May was quietly tending to a scrape on Skeeter's arm, using a poultice made from local willow bark. "That ain't the end," Daisy said, not looking up. "No," Jed agreed, looking out at the vast, green sea of the Appalachians, which now hid the secrets of their own personal, brilliant redneck war. "But the fight's here, in this here ground," he patted the dirt beneath his boot, "is still ours." They were the awesome, quiet backbone of the resistance. They had traded in their simple lives for a life of perpetual defense, using ingenuity and the profound, untamed knowledge of their home to beat back an empire. The KRYL had planned for jets, tanks, and missiles. They hadn't planned for 4 rednecks and a mountain. And that, Jed knew, was the greatest military failure in the history of the galaxy.